What's up guys, I'm Morley from Yellowron Blog. Hot off the heels of my first bent lamination project, I could not wait to bend wood again. So today I'm going to show you how I made this catch-all for my everyday carry using bent lamination and woven leather.
The first step of the project was figuring out how big to make the catch-all. I started by drawing simple shapes in AutoCAD to represent the items I usually have with me. When I was happy with their configuration, I drew a simple rounded square around the objects. I offset this shape outwards to account for the veneer thickness and pulled it into 3D to get a sense of how tall I wanted the piece to be. I also used the model to calculate the perimeter of the catch-all so I knew how long to cut the veneer strips. The wood portion of the catch-all is built up from layers of oak veneer that I bought at the Home Depot. I had a bunch of this left over after making the bent lamination tape dispenser. This 12-inch by 99-inch roll was only about 20 Canadian dollars, so basically free in US dollars. You can see as I cut the strips that I had some issues with splitting. Every time I cut the veneer, it wanted to split along the grain and roll back up. I don't think this mattered much in the end, since all the thin layers eventually got glued together. I left these strips to soak in water for 2 days to limber up before forming. To make the form, I printed out the AutoCAD model at 1:1 scale and cut it out to use as a template. Like the tape dispenser project, I made the form out of 3 layers of 3/4 inch MDF. I glued the template to the MDF, but ended up going around the paper with a pencil line since the template started to peel off the MDF once I started cutting. I drilled out a slot to get started and went to town with my jigsaw to cut out the first layer of the form. I planned the cutting so I could get the inner and outer form from the same footprint of material. However, this made for a bit of an awkward cut since the second pass was really just to remove the thickness of the catch-all for the outer form. Once I had one layer of the outer and inner form cut out, I cut each one into 2 pieces to facilitate the molding and demolding process. I made sure to cut unique curves so that it would be really clear how these go back together. I used the first layer to trace 2 more layers of the form onto the MDF and got to work as a human CNC. In all actuality, a CNC would have been super useful to cut this form out, but it was very doable with the jigsaw. Just a solid arm and shoulder workout. Kind of like doing slow push-ups for an hour and a half. Once I had all 3 layers cut out, I glued the form together in stages. First 2 layers, and then the third on top. This was actually one of the trickiest parts of the project, since the layers really want to slide around as they're clamped, and I was trying for a perfect alignment because I really wanted to avoid having to sand the edges too much. If I were to do this project again, I would use the trick of sprinkling salt on the glue surfaces to cut down on all this sliding. Once the glue had dried, I sanded the faces of the form flush. Thankfully, my neurotic glue up paid off, and this actually didn't take that much sanding. I also coated the contact surfaces of the form with packing tape to try and avoid the veneers sticking to the form. After soaking the veneers for 2 days, they were pliable enough to form. I didn't use any glue on this first forming. This step is purely to bend the veneers into shape so that the final forming with glue is a lot easier. It also minimizes any cracking of the veneers in case you have any tight radii to bend around. The form went together a lot tighter than I expected, so much so that I really had to hammer everything together. It was so tight that I couldn't completely close all the gaps in the form, but since there was no glue in the first forming, it didn't really matter at this stage. I let this big block dry for 3 days before demolding. Before the final forming, I removed the packing tape and did a bit more sanding on the contact faces of the form to reduce the tightness of fit. And yes, I was sanding in the bathroom because it was raining outside. No shop, no problem. I retaped the form and got to work gluing all the veneers together. I probably should have splurged on a silicone glue brush or something for spreading all this glue, but you know, it did give me a pretty decent finger workout. The sanded down form went together really nicely until the sides of the catch-all started to buckle outwards as I hammered on the last piece of the form. So, in a frenzy, I knocked everything apart and redid the final forming, rushing before the glue had a chance to dry. This time, I used a clamp to hold the veneers in place while I hammered on the final piece of the form. This technique works super well. I left the glued up assembly to dry for about 4 days. After demolding, the piece was still a little wet, and I used this as an opportunity to wipe down some of the excess glue with a damp cloth to cut down on sanding later. Once the wood was fully dry, I used my Japanese pole saw to trim away the ragged edges of the catch-all body. I bought this tool for making the bent lamination tape dispenser, and I just keep finding new uses for it. It's super handy, especially since I don't have the room for a bandsaw. I'll leave a link for this saw in the description, along with the other tools I use for this project. You may have noticed that the setting has changed since I moved into my new apartment during this project. At this point, I did a pretty thorough sanding of the bent lamination piece. Since the catch-all body doesn't form a closed loop, it's not an inherently stable shape. So, I attached some pieces of dowel to the piece with epoxy to give it some stability. I know these don't look great, but they eventually got covered by the woven leather surface, and you can't even see them in the final product. Speaking of leather, I cut 14 strips of veg tan to create the surface of the catch-all. The only finishing I did on the leather was beveling the edges and oiling with neat's foot oil. I really wanted the look of raw leather on this piece, and I'm hoping for a nice patina to develop over time. I wove the strips together and compared the dimensions of this weave with the wood piece so I could figure out where to attach the strips to the wood. I marked the hole locations on the wood to achieve this spacing and drilled out all the holes. With the woodworking done, I did a final sanding up to 220 grit and applied a couple coats of spray-on satin polyurethane. When the finish was dry, I was ready to put everything together. I attached the leather strips to the wood piece with a bunch of these little nuts and bolts that I've had kicking around for a while. I considered a bunch of methods for attaching the leather to the wood, and I felt that this one had the best balance of simplicity and classiness. I'm also just a sucker for using up extra materials. Once I had 2 sides done, I wove the strips together before attaching the final 2 sides. On these last sides, I pulled the leather taut before marking the location to be punched to get a nice uniform surface. The final step of the project was probably the most satisfying of the entire build, trimming the excess leather with a razor blade. To be honest, I'm sure that a nice bowl, tray, or even drawer would work flawlessly as a place to put all the stuff from your pockets. But The cool thing about making a totally unnecessary piece of furniture is how many doors it opens for really unique design. If it's unnecessary, you can make it however you want. All this to say, I think this is a pretty sweet place to put my phone. Thank you for watching, and be sure to check out the rest of my channel. I have a whole bunch of other build videos, and I'm sure there's something else that you'll enjoy.